welcome to another episode of Paranormal People. My name's Alex and I'm your host. We are back after a bit of a hiatus, and today I'm speaking with Andrew Bauer. Andrew has had a couple of near-death experiences, which will probably leave you questioning the very nature of life, death, and what it is to truly exist and what comes after. So Andrew is somebody who's lived through both of those experiences, which occurred under quite terrifying circumstances. One of them was at a camp when he was a teenager, followed by a survival story, really. So Andrew, thank you for joining me. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me.
So Andrew, can you tell me about the first experience? If we start from the bottom, what happened?
The first one actually started when I was age 7, and this was due to a severe virus that was affecting general area that I lived in, which was Western Massachusetts. And it had the symptoms of something like a chronic fatigue syndrome, high fever, like 100, 101, severe dehydration, severe lethargy, like people were sleeping 18 to 20 hours a day, couldn't, stay awake, couldn't eat, things of that nature. And all of them ended up in the hospital. There was about 4 to 5 dozen kids that were affected. And some of them, I'd say about half, got the more mild version of the virus, like my brother. He was home in 48 hours, and that's the way about half of them were. But the other half ended up staying longer. Of the half that stayed, I'd say probably 13 of them ended up going into a coma of one length or another due to what ended up being sepsis, which started attacking the internal organs, which became septic shock when they started shutting down. And eventually it got to the point for the worst of us where the only organs left were the heart, lungs, and brain, and they were under attack too. And eventually, in my case and in the case of 6 others, we all lost our battle with the virus and ended up going into a coma. Or actually, we were already in a coma, but basically we ended up dying during the coma. And mine lasted for, I think the coma lasted for a total of 16 days. But the death part only lasted about 7.5 minutes. My grandmother happened to be in the room at the time, and she remembers the Code Blue team come rushing in, shuffle her out into the hallway, and start performing CPR, start giving me ampoules of epinephrine, which is just adrenaline shot, basically. And then they ended up having to shock me not once, but 3 separate times. It was finally on the third shock, after 6.5 minutes, that they finally got a sinus rhythm and brought me back.
Wow. Okay. So an intense experience. What was life like before that incident?
Before that, I was in a gifted class for a couple of years, but I hadn't even started first grade yet. But there was a gifted class nearby that serviced kids that were high IQ. And later on in life, I ended up joining the group Mensa, which is a international group for people with the top 1% of all intelligence level.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And yeah, I had 138 IQ when they measured me at age 16. That's when I joined. My grandmother was already a member before I was born, and my mother and I both joined on the same day. So we had 3 generations who were all members of Mensa.
Bloody hell.
So basically I was like preschool wasn't good enough for me. I was too curious. I taught myself to read at the age of 3, taught myself to swim and ski at the age of 3. So I was very much ahead of my classmates at that point. So they put me in a gifted class to learn stuff that normally would be taught to 4th and 5th graders.
Okay.
And so I was very intelligent, but I was also very curious. I was very outgoing, loved to be around people, couldn't stand to be alone for 5 minutes. And then when I had the virus, it changed my whole personality from what my mother and grandmother both told me, where I was isolated and didn't want to be around people, wouldn't speak to anybody for most of a month because I was so in shock from what I'd been through and lost that I didn't know how to handle what I'd been through. But before that, I was really outgoing kid. So it really just was night and day difference between me before and me after.
And I can imagine with that kind of level of intelligence, it must be very different to growing up, I suppose, in like a normal school, or what would be considered a normal school. Would you experience anything, I suppose, out of the ordinary that you might not have experienced if you weren't in that situation?
Yes. Basically, for the one thing, I was way too intelligent, not to toot my own horn, but I was way too intelligent for the level of kids that I was in school with.
Yeah.
I had a lot of kids that ended up bullying me from 3 months after my first near-death experience all the way through till right before I turned 16 when we moved to North Carolina.
No, I'm sorry to hear that.
It's okay. But it is, it's something that affected me for a long time. It still in some ways affects me, especially the physical parts of it.
Sure.
But it's something I definitely would not have experienced had I not been in a public school. If I'd been in a private school or homeschool, obviously I wouldn't have been bullied like that.
No. And would you say that shaped who you became later on as an adult?
Very much. Basically, what I went through with the bullying at the time, it caused a lot of mental and psychological issues. I spent 7 months between inpatient and outpatient psychological therapy in the psych ward just after we moved to North Carolina when I was 16. I was very depressed. I was suicidal. I actually tried to take my own life twice at 16 and then again at 22. But it definitely affected me for a long time. And then when I finally kind of faced my own demons and dealt with them, which I had to do entirely on my own because the people my parents sent me to, none of them were any help. They actually made it worse, if anything. So basically, I had to deal with this for 20 years on my own. And so I came out stronger, though.
Sure.
And, it made me more empathetic, very sympathetic to other people who were suffering and going through pain. And it changed my entire life from that point forward, where I became, an advocate for anti-bullying, anti-abuse. Later on, anti-racism, anti-xenophobic, anti-homophobic, basically all the activism type stuff that was going on, I was a part of it. Yeah. And defending people who were unable to defend themselves was kind of my central core theme, if you will.
It's really commendable, and it does show that there's light at the end of the tunnel for people who've been through a lot of trauma like that throughout childhood and even through adulthood. And it's brave of you to discuss that so openly as well. So I do appreciate that. Going back to the first NDE, could you tell me a little bit more about sort of those symptoms that you had following that incident?
So basically, I came in with severe dehydration. I came in with a fever of 101. Within 48 hours, it spiked to 105. I think by the time I got to my actual death experience, which was day 6 of my coma, which was 12 days into my hospital stay, I had a fever of 107. So basically, my brain was boiling inside my skull. So once you get to that point, sepsis and septic shock start to attack your system, and it's basically like your body turns on itself. And it started with my stomach and digestive system. I would throw up everything they tried to feed me, even if it was by IV. I would throw up constantly day and night. And then it attacked my liver, my kidneys, my pancreas, and basically everything around the inside of my body. And then the body puts you into a coma to preserve the function of your lungs, heart, and your brain, to try to preserve your life. And that's about where it came into. And finally, the septic shock attacked my lungs and heart together. And then a couple hours later, my brain, and I was basically clinically dead for 6.5 minutes, but it shut my whole body down. And, after I came back, I was still in the hospital for another week, trying to recuperate and recover my basic lung function, heart function, brain function, all that type of stuff.
And at the time, were you going through it when you were going through this stuff while you were conscious? What was going through your mind, or can you remember what was going through your mind at the time?
Some of it I can remember, some I can guess based on what my grandmother told me, because she spent most of the time with me. My parents had to work and take care of my brother at home, so they weren't able to spend as much time with me. So my grandmother volunteered. She said that I turned inward because they had me in an oxygen tent, basically. So I was isolated from everybody and everything. Even she, as a visitor, was not allowed to spend more than an hour a day with me, and she couldn't touch me. And as someone who was used to being able to connect with people and, give people hugs and whatever the case might be, especially at the age of 7, it was like hell for me because, I didn't know what was going on. All I knew is I felt like my body was being ripped apart from the inside out. I was alone. All I had was doctors and nurses that kept popping in and out to take blood, but none of them would talk to me. None of them would even acknowledge my presence. So it was like I was just a body lying there for them. And so it it kind of made me just turn inward, where I wasn't talking to anybody. I wasn't expressive. I wasn't acknowledging their presence. Kind of like I guess I felt like they did. Where if they're going to not acknowledge my presence, I'm not going to acknowledge theirs. And I just kind of laid there, but I was scared. Um, and, and when my body started to shut down, I could feel it happening. And, um, and I had no concept of what death was or anything of that nature, but I knew something was very, very wrong, and that the doctors didn't seem to be able to stop it. So yeah, I was scared out of my mind.
And I know it was a long time ago and you were young, so I guess the details are probably quite hazy. But can you remember experiencing anything during that period, those 6.5 minutes whilst you were clinically dead? Did you experience anything, or was it just kind of black, or was there nothing?
No, I definitely experienced something, that's for sure. It's basically when I first died, uh, it, I was all of a sudden up in the corner of the hospital room, and I could see myself. I could see the code blue team around me. I could see my grandmother's face through the window in the door, and I could, and I didn't know what was going on because, like I said, I had no concept of death. I certainly didn't have any concept of an out of body experience. So I didn't know what was going on. I guess I kept trying to swim through the air, trying to get back to my body because it didn't feel right. But then I heard these three voices inside my head, and at that time I couldn't see them yet. But there was these three beings that felt like they were right there with me. Said, "You're okay. Don't worry. You'll be fine. But just calm down. You're okay." And eventually, they were able to calm my fears, and at that point, I was just more curious than anything once the fear subsided. Um, and I didn't know what was going on. And I kept thinking in my head, where am I? Why am I up in the corner of the ceiling? Um, and I kept asking all these questions, but in my head. And then all of a sudden, one of the three voices started answering me. And it freaked me out. And I said, how do they know what I was thinking? And the being who was speaking to me said, on the other side, all communication is telepathic. We can see it, we can hear and understand you. We can hear your thoughts. You can hear us. And there's no need to try to speak because you no longer have a body. You're a spirit now. You don't have vocal cords. You don't have a mouth. So there's nothing there for you to speak with. So that's why we use telepathy. And at that point, I looked down, expecting to see feet, legs, arms, hands, the body that I'd always known for the few years that I've been alive. But instead, what I saw was this kind of glowing, amorphous blob of light that kind of flowed, and it almost looked like it was a sheet fluttering in a soft breeze. And I felt full of energy, and and I noticed that I was not feeling any pain. I was not feeling any like physical symptoms at all. And I thought that's kind of strange because I was in so much pain 2 seconds ago. And the being came back and said, "That's normal. You're in the passing over stage and you're going to the other side." And I said, "The other side of what?" And he said, you're basically dead right now. And, you're no longer in your body. As you can see, your body is lying in that bed, but that's not who you are. You continue on, and you always will. And he said, we need to show you something. Please come with us. And I felt them kind of pull me up through the walls and ceiling, basically, because I was in the corner of the room, and everything went black for a few seconds, or what felt like a few seconds. And then the next thing I knew, I was in this place. It felt like a room, but it felt like it was changeable, if that makes sense. Like they could change it to adapt to whatever needs they had. And it was made of these walls and that were see-through, very very translucent. They were this bluish green color, and very they were made of energy, and it almost, you could feel it, like if you tried to reach out to touch the wall, there was like a barrier preventing you from actually touching it. Like you weren't touching the energy, you were just touching the barrier around it that kind of gave it that shape, but it felt like it was alive. And this room, I found out, was where they take you so you can acclimate to the other side, accept the fact that you're dead, and basically answer your questions if you have any. And of course, I had a bunch because I'm 7 years old. I'm curious. I'm dead. What's going on? And this same central being did most of the talking this whole time I was there, and he was a very wonderful, calming presence for me. He felt like a father figure almost, in a way, especially at that age. And he reminded me a lot of my father's father. My paternal grandfather, in the way that he was stern but kind. And he basically said, "Look, you're on the other side of the veil between life and death, but you're not completely gone yet. And there are things you need to see, things you need to go through, but we are here to guide you through them. And, are you, like, do you feel like you're ready to see these things?" And I said, "Well, what do I need to see?" And he said, "There's an experience you need to go through called a life review. And during this experience, we cannot be in the room with you, but we will be nearby. You'll be able to hear us, and we'll be able to hear you." And what this is, I don't remember how exactly he worded it, but basically that this experience was going to be a review of what life I'd had so far, but also not just me seeing my life like a movie, but seeing it from the point of view of the people that I had affected. So, like, if I did something to somebody or said something to somebody, I would feel how they felt having it said or done to them. And I had no idea how that would feel. I didn't have that frame of reference yet. But they brought me to this uh, corridor made of the same blue green energy that the room had been made of. And the room kind of faded away out of my vision. And there were little rooms on both sides of this corridor that they're kind of recessed down into the floor. And each one had a pod. And the pod was kind of, I don't know, maybe like 6 or 7 feet long. And basically, you were meant to lie down in this pod. And that's where you would have your life review. And so they helped me into it. And they said, like, we'll be outside, but we cannot help you through this. This is something you must go through alone. It's a very private experience. And so they closed the pod up over me and went outside. And then immediately, as soon as the pod closed, my life review started. And this was it was the freakiest experience I'd ever had at that point in my life, to say it mildly. Um, it was what I call a 4D experience set up as 3D. It was not just length, width, and depth. It was like, it wasn't like seeing a movie. It was like being in it. Like I was reliving the parts of my life that I was seeing. And I would shift back and forth between my viewpoint, what I'd done, what I'd said, and immediately shift to the person that I was speaking to or doing that thing to, and would experience how they felt, good, bad, or indifferent. So it wasn't a punishing thing. It wasn't a judgment thing. It was just showing you this is the way things were, not embellishing, not exaggerating, not biased in any way. Just this is the reality of what happened. And like I remember this one time when I think was maybe 5 years old, my one of my cousins, he and I used to hang out all the time, and he had this really cool um like a 1965 Mustang Matchbox car, really cool car, and I really wanted it, but my parents didn't want to buy it for me. But so he went to the bathroom, he had his back turned for a minute, and I took the car and I slipped it in my pocket and didn't think anything of it, just hey, it's a cool car, I want it. Boom, I've got a car now. But after I left and he couldn't find it, turns out it was his favorite toy, and so he was crying, "Mommy, can you help me find my car? Where's my car? I can't find my car." And his mother couldn't console him for like 2 or 3 hours afterwards. And I had no idea that I'd done this to him, that I'd made him feel this way. And it hurt my heart to see it because, of course, I never want to hurt anybody. I certainly don't want to hurt my cousin. I loved him. But, it's to show everybody that what you do affects not just you, it affects everyone around you. And for me, that was I guess, the biggest takeaway from especially that part of my near-death experience, but the overall experience itself was that we're not alone in this. We're connected to everyone and everything in the universe, especially here on Earth. And so what we do affects everyone. It doesn't just affect us. We are not living in a bubble or a vacuum. So for me, that was the excuse me, the biggest lesson of that life review. And when I came out of it, I was a little bit upset about that part of it, but I was mostly okay because I hadn't really done anything that bad at 7 years old. It wasn't some demon child or anything. So after I came out, the being said, "How do you feel?" I felt fine, and I said, "What's next?" And I was like, curious kid, rubbing my hands together. "What's next, guys?" And they said, "Well, if you would like to look around for a while, you can do that. We'll be nearby if you need us. You'll be able, if you need to ask us something, just ask. We can hear you." And so I kind of was able to wander around by myself. And for some reason, I found that by just focusing on something, like okay, I want to check out that room down the hall, boom, I'm there all of a sudden. I didn't have to walk to it.
Like
And
teleportation.
that was, yeah, I was teleporting. It was like, wow, this is really cool. It's like, I felt like I was in a comic book, because at first I'm, talking to people inside their heads. Now I'm like jumping around like a teleporter. And then, what's next? And as soon as I asked what's next again, all of a sudden I was in this field on the side of a mountain, and it was full of wildflowers that I'd never seen, of just about every color in the rainbow. And every color had its own sound, its own frequency. And together they were like a chorus. And it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard then or since. I've never heard a sound on earth to equal it. And what I learned is that everything, not only just objects, but colors and even smells, they have their own their own frequency. That's what makes us react to different things different ways. Our like certain frequencies clash with ours, so we don't like them. Like if you don't like a taste of something or the smell of something, it's because its frequency, its energy frequency is clashing with yours. If you really love something, it's because it's symbiotic with yours. So, like I said, this whole thing was like a chorus, and it was beautiful. I just kind of laid down in this meadow. There was like a line of mountains that I was on that, went from left to right. And then there's this deep, really deep valley, several thousand feet down. And across the way was another line of mountains going, from my left to my right. And as I turned and looked toward it, because the sun in my vision was getting close to setting, and right about where the sun was, there was this mountain with a slanted tip on it. And it was very different from the rest of the mountains around me, where they had just kind of a straight tip or something of that nature. And it stuck in my mind. And just as an aside, later on, I drew, like, I was with my grandmother because she's the only one who believed me when I came back and started talking all this stuff. And she had me try to draw some of the stuff I'd seen. And the first thing I drew was this mountain. And she said, that looks really familiar to me. And I don't know why. Let me see if I can find out. Well, this is 1978, so we didn't have the internet. We didn't have Chat GPT or anything like that to look something up. Well, all we had was an Encyclopedia Britannica. And so she pulled out her copy and started looking through, and she got to Europe and started looking through that, and she found this picture, and she brought the book back with her, and she showed it to me. I said, "That's it. That's my mountain. That's my mountain." It was the Matterhorn in Switzerland.
Wow. Okay.
I'd never seen it. I'd never been there. I'd never even seen a photograph of anything outside of my area where I live. So that right there kind of made me think, like, first of all, how did I see this? Second of all, if I saw this and it's real, if that's a real place, that means everything else I saw was real too. And it really solidified in my mind that something had happened, and it wasn't just my imagination. But so anyway, this place was very peaceful. I felt very at home there, and it was just like between the chorus of the flowers, and then the beautiful sky, and the sun would just kind of sit there. It didn't set. It just kind of sat in this one angle, which I've always thought was very beautiful, like right before sunset. And the clouds were this gorgeous mix of gold and like a coral pink color. And it was like one of my, if I could have taken a screenshot of just that one scene, like that would be my favorite picture ever. And come to find out later that this place that I was in, because I went to it again later during my second near-death experience. That field was where I lived in a previous lifetime,
Okay.
3 lifetimes ago. I had a cabin in that very field. My wife and 2 children lived there. We farmed. I was a healer, so we grew our own herbs and things like that I would use in my healing. And so I spent my entire life farming and helping people in my general area where I live. But that was for me home. Even though I had other lifetimes, other homes in between then and now, for me, that was like my spirit home. It felt magical to me. So that's why I keep going back to that same place, because for me, that's where my spirit wants to be. But so after that, I actually, I kept looking up into the sky, and I saw the stars were just starting to peek out, because of course the sun wasn't completely set, but it was set enough where you could see some of the stars start to peek out, and they were 3-dimensional. Like when we look at the sky here, it looks 2-dimensional. You just see a point of light in the sky, but there it was like the stars were at different distances. Like I could almost reach out and touch them, and it was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. And right as I thought of the stars, the sun set, and it was automatically nighttime, and there was an energy all around me, all through the whole valley. That was this beautiful, like it was white energy, but it had kind of a pink and blue tint around the edges, and so it was almost like flowing lightning. Like it wasn't sharp cracking lightning, but more like lightning that kind of flowed and ebbed, and it just kind of moved around, and it connected to everything, including me. And every time I kind of reached out to play with it, it would kind of retreat away from me and then come back, retreat and come back. But it was as soon as I kept concentrating on the stars, all of a sudden I was out in space, and I was looking down at the Earth from perspective of being out in orbit. And of course, I had never seen the Earth from the outside before, not even in pictures. I saw many more later, but I had not seen it yet. And all I saw was this glowing blue, green, and brown orb with no lines, no countries. I was used to a map with like countries that were different colors, like pink and orange and yellow and green, and none of that was in evidence. Like I didn't know. First, I didn't know what I was looking at, but then I realized this is Earth, and I'm seeing it from the outside, and all I saw was this one planet. It was not individual countries. It was not individual people. It was like one planet, one species, one Earth for all of us, and everything was connected. And there was energy that surrounded the Earth that was going in every direction and connecting to the sun, connecting to the moon, connecting to other objects in our solar system, connecting to parts that were way outside of our solar system, and other parts were connecting to it. And it was like this ebb and flow of energy that connected to everything. And I realized later that that was how that everything was connected in that way. And so that's why when we do stuff, it affects everyone around us and everything around us because we are directly connected to everything and everyone. So it was amazing. And then right at the end, I could, excuse me, I could feel my grandmother thinking about me back in the hospital. And it immediately drew me right back from orbit all the way back to my hospital room. And I could see her standing outside crying and worrying about, was I going to be okay? Was I going to survive? And I could hear what she was thinking, same as the beings heard me, and I could hear them. And she thought I was going to die and that I wouldn't be able to come back because she'd never seen a 7-year-old hooked up to so many machines or being shocked before. She'd seen a couple of adults have it happen to them, but never a child.
A horrifying sight as well.
And yeah, it was horrifying for me to see it, even though I knew I was not in the body at the moment. But the beings were back with me, but they were invisible again. Like I couldn't, while I was in the room, I could hear them, but I couldn't see them. I could only see them when I was on the other side. And the same male voice spoke to me again and said, "Yes, it's time for you to go back." And I said, I love this place. It's so beautiful here. Can I stay? And he said, "No, I'm sorry, you can't, because there's more that you need to do. There's people that you need to help. And when you recover from this experience, you will help people. And that is your purpose in this life. And we hope that you will fulfill that purpose." So at that moment, they retreated from me, and I just sat there for a moment, and then all of a sudden, I was right back in my body. Like no time had passed at all. Like I was in the corner, I was in my body that quickly, and all of a sudden, I was choking. I was waking up, but the light was just so bright to me, like it was blinding, and it hurt my eyes. My body felt like someone had ripped it open and then tried to shut it over something that was way too big to be in it. And I realized later on that that was my soul, my spirit, because outside of the body, it has no limits, and it's huge, it's expansive, and there's no limit to it. And then try to cram that back into this little tiny 7-year-old body for me was like trying to cram a cloud the size of Texas into a 1-foot square box. It just doesn't work. And so everything hurt. My body felt like it was, like I said, it felt like it had been torn apart. And I was crying and screaming, but I was alive. And my grandmother came rushing in despite the protests of the doctors and the nurses, and threw her arms around me and just hugged me and wouldn't let me go. And but then I ended up, after I came back, even though I was awake temporarily, my body still was not healed yet, and so they actually induced a coma to let my body heal. And so I was actually out for another 6 days after I came back from my near-death experience before they would let me wake up. And eventually, once they checked me, they allowed me to finally go home. But I was in the hospital for almost a month, so it was a crazy experience.
Yeah, no, absolutely crazy. I mean, firstly, what an amazing grandmother that you had. I mean, yeah, to be there that entire time and to witness that, but also to believe you when you came out of the experience. I guess it must be such a rarity for most people to have somebody who just unequivocally believes that tale, especially from a child. And I guess it's probably it shows really how authentic that must have been. You coming out of that and having those talks about the mountains, and there's a lot to unpack. So
Yeah, like my grandmother, like she was very metaphysical from before I was born. She had very deep beliefs. She was not religious at all. In fact, a lot of her influence came onto me throughout my early life.
Yeah.
And so she considered herself spiritual, like she believed in a higher power, but she was not religious. And I kind of was the same way. So that's why I think she believed me, but my parents didn't. My brother didn't. Nobody believed me outside of her.
No, and I guess that's something to really treasure. And I can imagine those memories of your grandmother must be even more powerful due to that experience as well.
Yes, very much.
So, in terms of those, other people do have NDEs with religious experiences. So they might see God or the Virgin Mary, or see the gates of heaven. Do you think maybe these beings you saw, maybe they manipulate what you see to make you more comfortable? Do they maybe show you what you want to see at that moment? What's your thoughts on that?
That's actually something that I spent a lot of years thinking about, because as I started reading about other people's near-death experiences, I realized that mine was different than most of the ones I'd heard about. Because back then, this is, like I said, this is way before the internet. This is way before YouTube. There was no videos of people's experiences. There was no books like, Map of Heaven, or, my Stroke of Insight, or any of that stuff that you can compare to. All we had was the religious experience, the one that was considered quote unquote acceptable by most people that I knew. And, it was a whole, long white tunnel, seeing your dead relatives, seeing Jesus and church and angels playing harps, the whole 9 yards. And I had none of that. So that made me question for a long time, was this real? I mean, my grandmother believed me. I felt like it was real, but like all I could think of is like, this experience doesn't match up with anything that I know. Everybody's telling me it's in my head. I'm making it up. Maybe I am. Maybe it's just in my head. Maybe I'm just, maybe I was seeing things. And so it took me a long time. And what I finally realized when I started putting things together, and this is a little ability that I came back with, when you mentioned like things that changed after a near death experience. I came back with this kind of ability to put the pieces together, to see the pattern and the picture that other people maybe missed. And what I could see was, okay, there's all these different experiences. There's religious experiences, there's metaphysical experiences, there's atheist experiences, agnostic experiences, and they're all different. So how could that be? And the first thing that came to my mind right off the bat was, what if these near-death experiences are intuitive and are able to adapt themselves automatically in real time to the mindset of the person having the near-death experience? And all of a sudden it was like eureka. Like everything fell into place, everything made sense. And ever since then, I have absolutely 100% believe that's exactly how it happens, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. Like a religious person having a scientific experience wouldn't accept it. A scientific or person or an atheist wouldn't accept a religious experience. So obviously it has to change in some way. Otherwise, they would not feel comfortable being in this experience. So the only way it could happen is if this experience was like a virtual reality type of deal, where it could be adapted to the person having it by the same. I mean, they communicate by telepathy. So it's not that much of a stretch to think that they could use this telepathy to have the experience adapt to the person that's having it. So that made sense to me.
Yeah, yeah. I think it did interest me when you mentioned that they kind of changed what you could see in real time around you. And coming to the past life side of things, you mentioned that you'd lived other lives, and this is something that's always fascinated me. This idea that we might just be souls that are drifting through the universe, maybe living different lives on different planets, or maybe it is just on Earth. And it'd be good to get your thoughts on that. And I suppose in terms of when you were actually having that experience, did you feel like you were 7 years old when you were in this, I guess, other realm, this other world? Or did you feel more mature? Was your mind more developed? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, when I first came into that experience, I still felt like I was 7, but very soon as I started to adapt and my thoughts were more on what was around me and what am I going to do next, that 7-year-old feeling kind of fell away. And I felt like I was more mature. And when I realized that I'd lived other lives, especially when I was in that field in Switzerland, and I realized that this was like a place that I had lived before. And I thought, well, if I lived other lives, being 7 years old now doesn't mean I'm 7 years old, period. And that that first thought was the one that really stuck with me more than anything. And so I've always felt like an older soul. Um, and the more that I recall about, especially my second experience, like I relived a lot of that, some of these older lifetimes. And so for me, like I've always felt like I've been around for a long, long time, and I'll still be around for a long, long time. And all of us are. So, you know, uh, I never felt like I felt like a kid for about 5 minutes over there. And then the rest of the time I felt like I understood things that a 7-year-old wouldn't be able to comprehend. I understood ideas automatically. And I found out later that we have that ultimate knowledge on the other side where everything, we understand everything automatically. We know everything automatically, and we can hold all this information in our heads without trying. So it's not like here where you're limited by your human brain, which is very limited, your body, which is very limited. The other side, we are energy based beings. And so we're not limited by the things that limit us here. So I always felt like I was much older than I should be based on, 7-year-old experience. But once I realized that that was not my only experience, that's why all of a sudden it felt normal to me.
Sure, and I think there's a lot of evidence in reality as well of that energy that you mention. It's kind of like when you walk into a room and somebody's had an argument, you can feel the energy, or you can feel the energy when somebody's showing you a lot of love. It's that positive energy. There's definitely many ways to feel energy, both positive and negative, every day, really.
Exactly.
I think. And I do feel like when you feel energy, it feels different to anything else. It's very hard to describe. And I've never experienced anything like what you have, but I can imagine it's almost like that on a whole other level. And I think it's a good time to maybe speak about your second experience, because I've got so many questions regarding the other world, but I'm also really keen to hear that other story. And I'm sure I'll probably be left with even more, but it would be good to understand what that second visit was like. Was it the same place? What kind of led to that? And then we can maybe unpack a little bit further your thoughts on this other world, for want of a better word. So can you tell me what led up to the second event and what happened?
Okay, second event was what you kind of partially described at the very beginning of the show. Between the first and second experience, the bullying had started. Now, during the first experience, I had been told what was coming for me. That's the first, like, if I could break it down as a simple statement, the first NDE was about me, my connections to other beings, my connection to the world. Where do I fit in? The second one was about the rest. It was like everybody else, the universe's connection to me, what is my eventual goal for this lifetime? Where do I go from here? And so it was more of an expansive NDE than the first one. But I was told during that first one that I would have multiple bullies that would target me. I would sustain multiple injuries, which I did. I ended up with 15 severe brain injuries and a severe lumbar spine injury, among many others, between the ages of 7 and 16. And unfortunately, they did a lot of permanent damage, which still affects me to this day. But by the point of the second near-death experience, I had received 13 of the 15 brain injuries from that, along with the spinal injury. And at this point, I was at a camp 2 hours away from home, and it was in a farm that had been converted over to this camp. The family that had lived there, I guess they passed away with no heirs to pass it to, so they basically donated it to this group that ran the camp. And so they converted their big 3-story barn over to offices on the first floor, and then the staff would sleep on the second floor, and the campers would sleep on the top floor, which used to be the loft. And the loft was basically directly under the A-frame roof that covered the barn. And every few feet along the inside of the roof, there were these 4x4 inch wood beams that were used to support it. And with each beam, there was the corner that stuck out into the room, because the way it was like flat oriented. So like the top of it was supporting the roof, the outside of it was supporting the roof, but then the other two sides were, made a corner that stuck out into the room. And we were told to just be careful around that, because obviously you don't want to get hurt. Prophetic words. What ended up happening, one of the other campers, as it turned out, was one of my biggest bullies. And he came after me before I even knew he was there, and knocked me over the bed that I was supposed to sleep in. Went around the bed, grabbed me by the neck and the shoulder, yanked me upright, punched me in the face 3 or 4 times, and then threw me as hard as he could backward toward the wall. And because I was bent over forward a little bit, the back of my head was exposed. And unfortunately, the height that it was at was the same height as the corner of one of these beams. And it made direct contact with the base of my skull, where your brainstem is. And if you're not familiar with how the brainstem works, one of the things that it does is control the basic life functions of the body. In other words, the lungs and the heart, especially. So as soon as I hit that beam full force, my lungs and heart stopped in an instant, and I dropped to the floor like a sack of potatoes, completely unconscious. And the kid who did this to me, he got scared, because, that's what bullies do, and he decided to run away. But other kids started calling out for help. Several of the counselors who were floor below us came running upstairs, saw me, crumpled on the floor. One of them, thankfully, was trained in CPR by the Red Cross, so he started performing chest compressions in the breast. We had, slightly different training back then than they have now for it. I think now it's more concentrated on keeping the heart beating, whereas back then it was a mix of the heartbeat and the breathing. But anyway, he tried to keep me alive, because when he tested me, he got no pulse, no breath, no breathing, no nothing. And I was starting to turn blue. So they had already called the ambulance. As soon as he started running upstairs, and yelled out, "Somebody call 911." And I could hear him, because I was already outside of my body, but I couldn't see anything yet. I just could hear things, and I just heard him yell out, "Call 911." And so they did, and I found out what happened later. The ambulance took about 3 minutes to arrive. I was already down that whole time. I hadn't breathed. I hadn't had any heart rate. And I was clinically already dead for 3 minutes. By the time they took their stretcher up 3 flights of stairs, got me loaded onto it, tied down, and then, you basically ran me back down the stairs to the ambulance. I'd already been down for 5 minutes. And so they got me into the ambulance, but the counselor was still doing chest compressions while one of the paramedics did the breaths. And these are all the way to the ambulance. And then one of the other guys, they had three of them there. One was driving and two EMTs in the back. And the two EMTs in the back took over at that point and started doing the chest compressions and the breaths. And they did this most of the way to the hospital. And it wasn't until I was, I don't know, maybe 2 minutes out from the hospital is when they finally got a, what you call a sinus rhythm. And I was officially back, but I was still unconscious. They ended up having to use these smelling salt things where little capsule they break up under your nose that kind of jolt you awake. But I was officially and clinically dead for, at this time, 7.5 minutes. And the kicker is 7 minutes is kind of the dividing line where if you're dead but longer than that, you start to experience brain death, and there's a chance that you could come back with brain damage, or you might not come back at all. In other words, your chances of recovering at all and recovering with full brain function are dropping with every extra minute past 7 that you're dead. So that's what led to my second one.
And during the time in the ambulance and when you were clinically dead on this occasion, did you go back to the same place or was it different?
I actually did. Instead of jumping up into the corner of the room like I did the first time, I actually went straight to the acclimation room, is what I guess is what I started calling it after that. And since I had already been through the first experience, I kind of had an idea how things were going to happen. And I knew where I was. I knew I was dead. And I'm like, okay, guys, I got it. I know where, I know where I'm at. But am I getting sent right back? Or what's the deal? And they said, no, there's a lot more you need to see this time around. And I said, oh, my life review is going to be longer this time. And he said, not just your life review. He said, there's a lot more you need to hear and you need to experience, you need to see. And he said, we might as well get started because we don't have much time. And so they took me into the life review chamber again, got in the pod. This time I'd had, I'd done more bad things because, teenagers, they always want to rebel and act out, and they're under peer pressure all the time. So they want to do things that impress their friends that are stupid. So, I had a lot more negative experiences as far as that goes with what I saw as far as other people and their reactions to what I did. But even at this point, nothing I did was overly harmful. I wasn't a particularly bad person. Even though I'd acted out and done some stupid or bad things, I wasn't, I was not the kind of kid who was a bad seed or was going to really try to hurt people intentionally. So after the life review, when I came out, the first question on my mind, because I'd seen it even during the life review, was all the bullying, all the injuries that I'd suffered. And the first question in my mind, of course, was why? Why am I going through all this? What have I done that, I deserve to be punished with this? And they said, you're not being punished. And I said, it sure feels like I'm being punished. I'm getting punched all the time. Every time I walk out of a room at school or go to my locker, I'm getting attacked by people. And they said, do you really want to know why this is happening? I said, of course I want to know. That's why I asked the question. And I had the same three guides with me that were with me the first time, and the same male voice that was kind of the central one that did all the talking. And he said, if you really want to know, we'll show you. You can see it for yourself. But I promise you that this experience will not be like the one you just had. It will not be pleasant at all. It's going to hurt you. And he said, I will ask you one more time. Are you sure that you want to see it? And the way he said it kind of made me sit back for a second, like, okay, wait a minute. Maybe it's not as good as I'm thinking it's going to be.
Be a bit nerve-wracking.
I said, Yeah, it's like, okay, let's look. I need to know what's going on. So please show me. So they put me back in the pod, and immediately it started up with um, 3 lifetimes ago, the one I lived in Switzerland, and this was a beautiful, wonderful life. I found out, how I was the farmer and the healer, had a wife and 2 kids, and lived to be in I think my 70s before I passed away. Had a really, really good life. Like they were showing me basically what a life when you follow the path that you intended to follow. If you do that, what your life can look like. And then they showed me the next one, and this one I screwed up as badly as you can screw up. As I was in, I went to work for a banking institution. I lived in New York, and this is during the 1800s, New York City, and what I had intended to do was help people gain financial independence, um, bring them out of like financial difficulties, and help them establish uh, funds for their kids, uh, parents to buy stocks so they could they could set money aside for their children and their education and things like that, and get them into homes where they could establish, a house to pass down to future generations and so on. But I got so entangled with greed and with the position and power that came with it. I was so obsessed with money. And what that did is it led me off of my path. And from that moment forward, everything that happened to me was completely unintended, first of all. And second of all, was the exact opposite of what was supposed to happen. Instead of helping people, I harmed them. And when I say harmed them, I mean I had hundreds of people that I stole money from, that I put in loans that they had interest rates they could not afford. So they ended up in debtor's prison. Families that ended up in homes with crazy payments that they couldn't afford, end up getting evicted, were out on the street. I had to watch these children that they had begging for money, begging for food, emaciated, like just lying on the street trying not to die. And I screamed over and over again, please make this stop. Please do not make me watch this. Please get me out of here. And the same male voice came back, but it was much sterner this time. You asked to see this. We cannot stop the experience once it starts. This is what you asked for. You have to see it. And it was like the voice was like, I'm not breaking any argument from you. This is what you wanted. I gave you the choice. Now you live with it.
Did
So
that change in tone make you feel kind of uncomfortable at all?
in a way, but at the same time, it was like he had to be stern with me at that moment because I was, I was being a little bit whiny. I'll admit it. I was being a whiny kid, and like, I don't want to hurt. I don't want to feel pain. So, get me out of this. And he knew that what I needed at that moment was a stern voice that said, you made this choice. We gave you the option. You chose to see this, so you're gonna stay in there until you're done. That kind of that was kind of the mentality of what he said.
Are you able to describe that voice?
And
Was it like a booming voice? Was it deep, or how would you?
it was that one was booming. Like I felt like I was about 2 inches tall. I mean, the rest of the time I felt like he was a stern but very kind grandfather. Like I could put my arm around him almost, and just I felt like completely comfortable with him. At that moment, though, it felt like he was putting me in my place, and I felt like I was about 2 inches tall.
And did you ever feel a threat during this entire experience? Did you feel like they
No,
would or could hurt you?
no, it was not a matter of nothing was going to be physically harmful. But the thing is, though, a lot of times what people don't understand, especially with those who feel a lot of pain, is that physical pain, as bad as it might seem, as bad as it is, a lot of times, doesn't hold a candle to mental and psychological pain, and that's what this experience involves. Um, like I said, seeing children emaciated, lying on the street, begging for money, begging for food, anything. Please help us. Please help me. Don't you have anything you could give me? And crying, and sometimes they were so emaciated they didn't have any moisture left, and so their tears were there was nothing coming out. They would cry, but nothing would happen. Nothing would come out of their eyes, and it broke me, Alex. It broke me in ways that I cannot even describe. Um, I felt like the worst of the worst person that I had ever experienced in my life. I had seen bad people described in my history classes like Hitler. I felt like Hitler to them. Like that. That's how it made it. Like the feeling that I got from them was this man destroyed our life. He he hurt us in every way you can hurt someone, and he's laughing all the way to the bank. And I was laughing. I stole their money. I was embezzling money from the bank. I had I don't even know I don't even know how much money I had, but I was living this opulent life. We had this huge house in the Upper East Side. We had an apartment down in Greenwich Village area. We went on these big lavish vacations a couple times a year. Kids were in private schools, so we were living it up, but it was on someone else's dime. And as much as I enjoyed myself during that lifetime, and I mean, I'm not gonna lie that um, I did not have any remorse. I felt no pity at all. I was as narcissistic as it comes. And but the person that I am now in this life is so much different. It's a complete opposite of that. And I couldn't stand to see myself, and I knew it was me doing it. It was not a question of, oh, this is somebody else's life I'm watching. I knew that it was me. I knew that it was a version of me, and that's what made it hurt all the more, because I couldn't imagine, me now cannot imagine doing any of that stuff to somebody, to one person, let alone to hundreds of them, and to do it over and over and over again for over a decade. I was as low down and broken as I could get, and like I said, there's still more coming. Um, Basically, they caught me at it. The bank found, they tracked the missing money to me, and of course, it should have been obvious considering the fact that I had this house and apartment and everything expensive, way more than I should have been able to afford based on my income. And so they ended up throwing me in prison. And of course, the court took everything: the house, the apartment, cars. I mean, not cars, the carriages that we had. Um, they took all the stuff that I'd bought for my wife, for my kids. Um, they sold it off to pay my debts, basically. And so almost immediately, as soon as I ended up in prison, my wife divorced me. My kids basically disowned me, would not speak to me ever again. The wife ended up taking the younger child and moved to, I want to say, Illinois. And the older child was out on his own by then with his own wife. So they moved to upstate New York, and none of them would speak to me again. People I thought were my friends would not come around. They basically ignored me, cut me out of their lives. Um, and as it happened, the prison that I was in, three of the other inmates were people whose families that I had harmed, and they of course knew who I was because the case made the news everywhere in New England, especially New York. So they knew who I was, and they also knew what I had done to them. And they always wondered, like, how did this happen? Why are we in here being punished? We didn't do anything wrong. And once they found out it was me and what I'd done, they knew. And three of them came after me one afternoon in the laundry. That's where I ended up working while I was in prison. And they basically stabbed me to death. I don't even want to know how many times. And at that point in time with New York, if you were indigent, like you didn't have any money for a burial, you were poor. If you were a prisoner who died, they would basically ship you by boat out to a place called Hart Island, which was in the middle of Long Island Sound. And there was an area there called Potter's Field, and it's where they buried these indigent people and the prisoners. And it was kind of an abandoned dump for people who didn't matter. And to go from this rich, opulent lifestyle to being buried in Potter's Field with no grave marker, nobody caring, nobody showed up, and nobody showed up at my funeral. In fact, a few of the families who had managed to recover enough of their financial ability to get back into a home, three of them threw a big old party, basically a ding dong, the witch is dead type of deal, and invited whoever wanted to come to enjoy the festivities to celebrate my death. So
it's almost like a Christmas Carol moment, isn't it? With
yeah,
Scrooge?
exactly. I was Ebenezer Scrooge on crack. If you want to put it that way, I was Ebenezer Scrooge on crack. And when I came out of that experience, there was actually another one, because I had another life in between that and this one. But that one was it only lasted 17 years. I basically had gone into it with the idea that I'm going to die early, and that's going to make up for what I did. So I was born in 1900. By the time I was 17, that's when the Spanish flu epidemic went around the globe and killed like half the population in some places. And so I got that. I died from the Spanish flu at 17. And then I was on the other side equivalent on this side for 53 years. Basically the same age I am now is how long I was on the other side for, in between my last life and this one. And when I came out of that, I didn't even notice hardly that last lifetime. It was that blinking you miss it to it. And when I came out of the pod, I was so weak, so broken that I just collapsed on the floor. And I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even speak in my head. It was that draining for me. And the one thing I noticed about the beings on the other side is when they were giving out love, when love would kind of flow through them to whoever they were aiming it at, their inside glow would glow that much more brightly. Mine was so dim, it was almost non-existent. That's how broken I was. And the being said, you wanted to see this. This is why. And I said, am I being punished? What like, I understand it was bad. Is that what you do here? Is that what you do? Is you punish people? And he said, no, this is not because of us. It was not because of God. It's because of you. And I said, what do you mean? That sounds like punishment. And he said, no, there's several choices you can make after you live a life like this. One, you've already seen, and that was your previous lifetime. You chose to go down, die early, come right back. But he said that life meant nothing. You didn't do anything to make up for what you did. And at this point, they took me outside that room and into another area, and he gestured toward these beings who were off by themselves in this dark area. And I had seen them before, but I didn't know who they were or what they were doing over there. And he said, do you see these beings here? And I said, yes. He said, they have chosen to segregate themselves away from the rest of us. They've chosen to cut themselves off from the light, cut themselves off from the love that is everywhere here, the peace that is everywhere here. But he said that was their choice. But the problem is the life that you lived, the last life you lived, and that choice, they are selfish. They are all about you, making you feel better, making you, think that you've done something to make up for what you did to all these people. But he said that doesn't change anything. He said basically it's the worst choice you can make, is to choose either of those two options. And I said, so if those two are the bad options, what's the good one? And he said, if you want to be honest,
the life you're living right now is the best choice. I said, the one where I'm getting beaten up every day. And he said, it's not about that. He said that part, that yes, you're going to feel pain. Yes, you're going to suffer. But the difference is you're going to use that pain and that suffering to become a stronger person, a better person, a person who has more empathy for your fellow human beings, more sympathy for their pain. You're going to use it to help people. And, and he said the difference between that and these two other options is a world of difference. I can't remember how exactly he put it. Basically that he said you're going to live, this life that you're living is called a life of atonement. And he very much emphasized that one word, atonement. And I sort of understood what that meant, but I didn't really. And he could sense that in my head. He could sense it like unasked question. And so he said, atonement is a difference between just making up for bad decisions and atoning for them. What you did in your last life, what they're doing over there, that is just making up for something. It's all about you, about your feelings, about your pain, your this, your that. But he said, if you really want to help people, if you really want to become a different person and use your pain to help others, feel their pain as your own and use that to lift them up, make them feel better. Whereas your life is about them, about others, not about you. He said that's what you're doing with your current life right now. That's life of atonement. That's the difference. And he said, this one life, no matter how long it lasts, he said 10 years of this life is worth more than 105 other lives like those. And so it was about the life of atonement. That's why I came back in this life, because I had a whole different plan for this life originally. But because of what I did to those people, my soul hurt. I felt so much pain inside that I wanted to tear open my own chest. When I came out of that pod, if there had been a real hell, an actual hell, I would have thrown myself into it. That's how broken I was, because I couldn't stand to even look at myself. And so I chose to come back in this life because I needed to do something that was not about me, was not about my pain, but it was about fixing things, about balancing the universe out. Because when you do these bad things and you make bad choices, the universe is out of balance. All your connections are out of balance. And it's all about you, and not like there's give and take with every connection. And so when you do something that throws that connection out of balance, you feel it. Your soul feels it. And all it wants to do is balance things out. And the only way to do that is to live this life of atonement. So that's what it became about for me. And now that I've come back from that and I understand why I had to go through all this stuff that I've been through, it has made it easier in a way. I mean, it still hurts every single day. I mean, I still have physical pain, mental pain, psychological pain. I'm never without that, but it doesn't overwhelm me anymore. It doesn't control me, because I use it to, like, every time I feel pain of any kind, my first instinct is to want to use that to go out and help somebody else, to take my mind off of me and put it onto them. And that's what I had to learn. And that was like for me, the hardest experience that I've ever been through was that one life review from that previous life.
Really positive outcome from that. And it sounds like it's changed your entire outlook. And to be able to pay things forward to other people is obviously very, very commendable. And I guess, they say that everything happens for a reason in life. And if your purpose was to see that and to be the best person you could possibly be from it, then I guess it's something that could be believed, really. And I did have a quick question just about the guides that you mentioned. I've spoken on this podcast to a few mediums who speak to kind of spirit guides, and they guide people on their path and on their past and their future. And I actually had a psychic reading with Danielle, who I interviewed on another episode. And she was interpreting symbols from her guide and speaking to her guides in order to sort of tell me things. And they were so accurate. I mean, I'm still a skeptic despite running this podcast. I probably always will be to a degree. I've had paranormal experiences myself. And I think, like you said earlier, you're still not fully sure. Maybe it was all a dream, although it's very, very unlikely. So I'll never fully commit to saying, yep, that was 100% real. But she was telling me things that I would never be able to know. And it's the most convinced that I've ever been. And do you think these guides are your personal guides that stay with you throughout your life and then you meet them at death? Or do you think these are guides you only see when you die?
They've been with me the entire time. And not just in this life, but every life. At least the last few, they were with me from the life in Switzerland forward. And basically because the beings on the other side know where your life is going, your overall life, not just your individual lifetime. It knows where your life is going, what you want to do with it. It puts guides with you who can best serve that purpose. And in fact, the main being that is always with me, the male voice that I always heard, he in his previous life took his own life because he was despondent over losing his parent. And when I say parent, for a reason, not parents, which I'll explain in a moment. But he was despondent over the loss of his father because they had basically left things unfinished and unsatisfied. So when the opportunity came around to live a life of atonement for what he'd done, not just in that moment, but also what he'd done as far as his parent was concerned, instead of coming back into a physical existence, he chose to become a spirit guide, which is another way to atone by helping others go through their journey rather than focus on your own. And so he's been with me since basically since the 1700s here. So what, 400 years almost that he's been with me. And the other two have kind of come and go. They're not always the same beings. I don't think they were the same in my second near-death experience as they were in the first. But the central guide, is always the one that's with me. And as a matter of fact, let me first describe when I say parent, why I say that, and then an experience I had just less than 24 hours ago that confirmed for me that he is real. First of all, he's not human. And so during my second near-death experience, I went out into space again like I did the first time, but instead of stopping just to check out the Earth, I went much farther. And when I say much farther, I mean I explored the entire galaxy, all over the place. I saw dozens of advanced civilizations that were far in advance of ours. One of them, they lost their planet to, I think what kind of burst it is. Some kind of burst. It's the one that's created when black holes form.
Okay.
And it basically strips off the entire atmosphere. If it hits a planet, it strips off the atmosphere, basically boils everything. Like there's no life left. And they knew in advance that this was coming. And so they basically combined all their ships into one big one that was the size of, I think, Jupiter's moon Ganymede. So you can imagine like one of the biggest moons in our solar system, a ship that's that size. That's how big it was. And their entire civilization was on this ship. And there's another one where even coming into the star system that they lived in, I could tell there were beings there long before I saw them, because I saw this giant sphere, almost like an Epcot center type of sphere, around the entire star and all four of the innermost planets. I mean, it's something that I found out later is called a Dyson sphere. Now, normally it's only around, the proposed idea would be to only put it around a star just to gather and use the energy from a dying star. But in this case, some former civilization before the ones that currently live there had built this Dyson sphere around the whole inner solar system of that star system. And so the innermost planet was not habitable, but the other three were. And these two beings that I ran across, one of them later explained that their civilization found it while they were, because they lost their planet also, in I think I can't remember some other extinction level event, something that destroyed their entire planet. They had to leave their solar system, and in their search for somewhere else to live, they ran across this giant Dyson sphere and found this solar system inside, basically all set up and ready to go for them. And the records that they found showed that it once belonged to another civilization that was much, much older, like billions of years older, like one of the original civilizations that existed in the universe. And they had built this thing and were probably one of the most advanced species that ever lived. Anyway, the reason I mentioned those two species is because both of them were evolved enough that when I came through, they were able to see my energy-based form on the other side because they were so attuned to both realms. And what I found out later from my spirit guide is that they're basically maybe a couple of rungs down on the evolutionary ladder from being able to shed their physical bodies entirely and exist only as energy-based beings able to travel back and forth between the two realms at will. So they could sense my presence and see me just like I could see them. And two of them were working on the Dyson sphere, basically shoring up their, what they call their integrity field, which was basically what kept the structure intact. And they, like I said, as soon as they saw me, they came over, they greeted me. They touched their forehead with, like, they had 4 fingers. They touched the forehead with 2 of their fingers and made a gesture out to me twice. And I guess that was their form of greeting. And they could speak to me in my head the same way that my guides could. And I found out that they were a telepathic race. And so we basically talked for a while, and they described the history of their civilization and how they got to where they were and what they do. And they said basically all 3 planets developed their own way because they'd been there for millions of years at that point. And so each planet had its own ecosystem, its own gravity, its own everything. And so each sect of their civilization that went to each different planet grew and evolved differently from the other 2. And so their bodies were really tall and willowy. Like they were, if you've ever seen the Star Wars prequel movies, the species called the Kaminoans, the ones who cloned
really tall,
all the army, and they're about 9-10 feet tall, very thin and willowy, almost ethereal. But instead of having like a solid body like that group did, they had much bigger heads. They were really long in the back to contain the huge brains that they had, and the front of their head, their face was basically it started in at the top and then slanted out towards the bottom, almost like a spade, if you can imagine that. And so anyway, I remember when I was describing them to several people over the last few days, the 2 words I used over and over were tall and willowy, all 3 times. And that'll come back in a moment. So that's why I'm mentioning it now. So anyway, this one being of the 2 stayed with me after his friend went away, and way he described parts of his life is that he said my parent and I were estranged, and I said, when you say parent, what do you mean? Which one? And he said, we only have one. We reproduce asexually. So they have the one parent, one child. They don't have multiple children. They don't have litter. They don't have eggs, anything like that. They just, they reproduce asexually. So he was the only child, and his parent was the only parent. But his parent had wanted him to stay on their planet, and they lived this very simplistic lifestyle, very agrarian. Very, about farming. They had these huge trees that were probably 400 or 500 feet high or taller. Very low gravity. So that's why they grew so tall compared to some of the other species that I saw. Like the first one I saw came from a planet where the gravity was more like 10 times that of Earth, and they were only maybe 3 feet tall, very muscular, very well-developed musculature. So that came from being from a high gravity environment, but these were from a low gravity environment. So they were very tall, willowy. They didn't need, much in the way of muscles or bone structure or anything like that. But anyways, he said we live in the trees there. We use the branches to swing from place to place. Almost like a mix of chimpanzees and Native Americans, if that makes sense. Like, I don't mean to sound like bad or anything. It wasn't, because they had a very strong belief system where it was all about living with the environment, using everything, never wasting anything, living in harmony with each other, with the environment. Is very much like a Native American mindset.
Yeah, and a pure race than the one we have in on Earth.
Yeah, I mean, not like the modern Native Americans, so like the ones that existed before the Europeans invaded, so to speak.
Yeah.
But so he kept describing this relationship with his parent, and he said, my parent wanted me to stay, but I've always had my eyes on the stars. I've always wanted to be exploring somewhere else, and I could not stand to stay here. And so one night I slipped off with my friend who you just met, and we went and joined the group that maintains our Dyson sphere, or they call it something else, obviously, but maintain our sphere so that we can continue to live and not, have something destroy us. So, but he wanted to go on and explore, but I guess he felt kind of guilty at first, so he stayed a little bit closer to home. But his father basically disowned him. Like, if you're not going to stay here with me, if you're not going to stay here at home, then don't bother coming back, kind of philosophy. And it led to them becoming estranged. And the way he kept talking, as he talked, the scene changed for me. And I didn't understand it at first because it didn't make sense. I thought I was seeing him like live, in that moment. But what I learned later was I was seeing a mental image of his life. He had taken his own life because his father got killed in an accident, in a really bad fall, and they had left everything unfinished and unresolved. And so he felt so guilty and despondent from losing his parent that he took his own life, which something that their culture, they cherish autonomy. So, like, they normally live several hundred years, but they allow them to take their own life, with dignity if they choose that route for whatever reason. Like, they feel like they've lived too long, they don't want to be around anymore, whatever the case might be. But he ended up taking his own life, and as he finished his story, the whole scene in front of me faded to black. And the next thing I knew, I was back in the back where the life review pods were, and I could feel a presence behind me. I turned around, and it was my main male guide, and he started talking. And as soon as he talked, I recognized his voice immediately, and it was that being that I had just been speaking to. He had been feeding this to me telepathically, the whole experience of his life, what he did, his planet, the way everything looked. He had been feeding it to me telepathically the entire time, and I never realized it. But, so he showed that, we have so much in common, you and I. We both have always wanted to explore. We've always wanted to be among the stars. We both had estrangements with our families. Me with my parent, you with your family. We both tried to take our own lives. You didn't succeed, but I did. And he said, ever since I first encountered you, I have felt a complete kinship with you. And so when the opportunity presented itself and I needed to live a life of atonement and you needed a guide, it was synchronicity. That's the word he used. And he said it was a perfect timing. It was what I needed. It was what you needed. So I became your guide. And he said, I've been with you for all of those lifetimes that you just saw in that pod. And I'll be with you for much longer than that, in the future. And I said, so how long are we talking? Because, I'm always interested in the future. And he said it never ends. Well, obviously the universe is going to end at some point. And he said, no, it's not. He said, I want you to think about this very hard. And he said, when you go back, eventually you'll figure this out. But he said, energy never dies. We are energy, all of us. And so is the universe. Everything is energy. Energy cannot be destroyed. It cannot die. So as such, the universe cannot die. We cannot die. We go on forever. And so he said, we'll be together for a long time, or as long as you wish to be. And so straying from that for just a moment, when I mentioned last night, the guy who created the near-death experience group that I'm in, and he had this woman named Barbara Gale on the show who's, I think, a medium. And at one point, she was listening to her guide and other beings who were connected to the people in the room, as far as like plants or flowers that would resonate with them that they should have around them. And when she got to me, she paused. And then she didn't mention a flower or a plant or anything of that nature. She said, I see a male being next to you. And at first I was thinking, okay, it must be my dad because, he just passed away a couple of years ago. So he'd probably be the most recent one. And then she said two words that made everything stop on a dime. She said, he's tall and willowy. The exact two words that I'd used to describe my friend from space 3 separate times in the past few days. She was using to describe him. Yeah, it's like she was seeing the same being that I had seen in my near-death experience. And I hadn't seen him. Like I've heard his voice on occasion, but I've never seen him since that near-death experience. So 39 years ago, I haven't seen him once since. She was seeing him standing next to me. I could feel my grandmother there because she and I are very strongly connected, even with her being on the other side. But I could sense her being there, but I didn't even know he was there until she said those two words.
And what were you doing when she saw this? Were you doing anything specific, or was it a specific kind of moment? Why do you think they kind of appeared at that point?
I just think that we had just finished kind of meditating and inviting the universal energy in, and like I breathe in this, I breathe out that. It was focus meditation, basically breathing meditation. And during that breathing exercise, I could feel my grandmother there. Like she had her hand on my shoulder, and I could sense her presence. And she has every being has a very specific energy to them that is unique and sets them apart from every other being in the universe. And so I was able to tell by her energy that it was her. But I didn't know that my space, I call him my space brother. I didn't know my space brother was there until Barbara said tall and willowy, and immediately like time stopped on a dime. And because no one else I've ever talked to has ever mentioned this being, knew he existed. I never even really mentioned him before this until just the last couple of days. And Barbara could see him, even though I'd never seen her, never spoken to her ever in my life.
Yeah. When you have multiple witnesses with these things, it becomes, I suppose, a lot more real. And if she's describing the same thing that you saw, that it's fascinating, really.
Yeah.
Amazing to hear from Barbara one day. if Barbara's listening, you never know. That would be very good. But yeah, I think it really is. It is fascinating, and all of this is just so mind-boggling. To think of these, I guess, supernatural or alien or whatever you want to call them, these beings that Are there to greet us when we die, or are there throughout our multiple lives?
Well, like you mentioned earlier, how like for you, you're still kind of the skeptic, where you want to believe, but you don't quite accept everything as gospel, and I can understand it, because for me that was me for probably most of 25 years, including my near-death experiences, but also afterwards, and it took me a long time. But at this point, I mean, I'm 53 years old now. And all the stuff that I've seen and heard and put together, because like I said, I came back with that ability to see patterns, to understand how things fit together. And it's a very specific ability. I could tell when I'm using it, or when things come to me, I feel the truth of them before I see the pattern. Like I know that what I'm going to hear is going to be truth. And for me, there is absolutely zero doubt what I saw, what I experienced, where I went, everything about it, because there's been way too much that I've seen, heard, experienced, felt, both during those experiences and since, that, I mean, like I heard in my first near-death experience, this stuff was going to happen to me in my future, in this life, the injuries I was going to receive, and the whole bunch of them came in exactly the order I was told they were going to happen. And they didn't start till 3 months after that near-death experience. So how would I have known about those things except that I was told them by somebody on the other side? Because I certainly couldn't have known any other way. So for me, there is no doubt that these things are real. And the more stories that I hear from other people that resonate and with me, and that also contain the same elements over and over and over again, times thousands, it's like after a while, you just have to say, you know what? It's got to be real, because, how could all these these disparate people who have never met, live in completely different countries, different eras, going back as far as recorded history, say the exact same things that they saw after they died and came back?
No, it's very true. There's always going to be a lot more weight when you've had multiple witnesses, but at the same time, everybody has their own experiences, and you saw what you saw, and you heard what you heard. And I mean, I experienced a haunting over a couple of years in an old house. I will be doing an episode on at some point, and I know exactly what I saw and heard and felt during those years.
Yeah.
I guess part of the brain wants to suppress it or not believe it. I guess there's times where you're worried about not being believed, but at the same time it happened, my brain still doesn't want to believe it, but I know deep down it did. And I guess at heart, I am a believer, and I believe every story I hear on these shows. There's no reason somebody would lie, but it's also the way that it comes across. It comes across as extremely genuine, and you're telling a story just as though you're telling a story that happened to you yesterday about, when you went to the shop. It's just as real as that.
Well, that in fact, the other thing I was thinking of when you were saying that is that for me, it's easier to believe that this stuff is real because I've had these near-death experiences, but you haven't. So it's harder for someone who hasn't had the actual experience or an actual experience.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
To really fully accept what they're hearing from people like me, because they haven't had that. They don't have that frame of reference to compare it to.
No, exactly. And it's fascinating to hear these stories. And the one that you've told today, or the stories you've told today, definitely match up with a lot of the other ones I've heard. And they're all very different in their own ways. But a lot of it's also very similar.
Mm-hmm.
As you said, all of these people, all these different experiences can't just be told tales or anything like that. So there's definitely...
It's not coincidence. It can't be.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. And this is one of the reasons for this podcast, is to speak to people like yourself and other people who've had experiences, speak to as many as possible and investigate it really and understand it better.
And I'm glad you're doing it too, because even if it's just, even if you don't necessarily fully believe in what you're being told or what somebody's story is, the fact that you're open-minded enough to let them tell it and to put it out there for other people to listen to and perhaps resonate with, that means a lot, because there's so many people out there who choose instead to to put us down or attack us or tell us we're making it up or it's your imagination. Like even one of the interviews I did, the very first comment under the video on YouTube was, you heard the voices in your head because it's all in your head, and I'm used to that. That's what I've been hearing my whole life is it's in your head. It's your imagination. You made it up, but I know I'm not. But to convince people who've never had that experience is not easy.
And I think from my point of view, you don't need to try and convince anybody. The people who have that open mind will listen and understand and believe. And those that don't, I guess they can carry on. Luckily with these podcasts, the majority of people who are listening will listen because they're interested in the topic. And there will, of course, you'll always get the odd naysayer, the odd person who doesn't want to believe and they want to spread their negativity, and let them do them. You will have 99.9% more people who are fascinated and on side.
And
that's
believe
the
it.
beauty of these things. Yeah, absolutely.
But it's like,
and I'm fascinated.
Yeah, like I was sent, when I was sent back both times, all I was told was, tell your story, don't embellish it, don't exaggerate it, don't lie about it, just tell it. And those who are meant to hear it will hear it. Those who don't won't. But the great thing about it is, like I told the person, the naysayer on that video I was just talking about, I said, it doesn't matter what I think or what I can convince you of. I'm not here to convince you, because when you pass away and you leave this world and you go to the other side, you're going to see what I saw. There's no doubt in my mind about that. It may be a doubt in yours, but when you cross over, guess what? You're going to see what I saw. So I'm not worried about trying to convince you. You're going to be convinced on your own.
Yeah. And we'll all find out one day. And that's the beauty of it.
It's life. Nobody gets out of it alive.
No, it's the one guarantee, and taxes, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
Taxes. Two big guarantees. But Andrew, thank you so much for your time. It was an absolute pleasure to speak to you and to hear your story. A lot of the things you've spoken about have been really, really brave to talk about. And yeah, just thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me, Alex. I really appreciate this.
No problem at all. Thanks, Andrew.
Take care.
What a great episode, and thank you for listening. If you would like to have a chance at appearing on a future episode, and you've got a scary story to tell, whether it's UFOs, ghosts, cryptids, or something else you can't explain, please get in touch at info@angryfoxmedia.com. Again, that's info@angryfoxmedia.com. Stay safe out there.